Hi everybody, I'm Hans Linssen, PhD student at the University of Amsterdam and affiliated with the Netherlands Institute of Ecology. And I'll be presenting a study that we did on how Buick swans adjust their wintering area to a warming climate. So as you probably all know, the Buick swan is a migratory swan species with breeding in northwestern Russia, coastal tundra, and wintering in the countries around the North Sea, at least the western Palearctic population. And as Rasha showed, this wintering area has been shifting massively over the past decades. So between 1970 and 2017, center of ring sightings in winter shifted more than 350 kilometers in northeastern direction. And this was the case both between generations, so every generation wintering progressively further northeast than the previous generation, but also within individuals. So individuals also shifted within their lives in northeastern direction. And the suggestion, of course, was that this would be caused by climate change. So milder winters enabling the swans to winter on progressively northeastern latitudes and longitudes. The question we started with is actually, does climate change indeed drive this shift? So can we explain what we see here with climate change if we look at what individuals do in autumn and in winter? We thought that to look into this would be important to look at individuals' decisions in autumn, because those are the decisions that eventually decide where the individual is going to end up in winter. We looked at it this way. This swan comes from the breeding ground and goes all the way to the wintering ground, and in between it makes some stopovers. And every day it makes a decision if it's on a stopover to either stay or to leave at a certain point if conditions are not favorable anymore. And at a certain point, the swan is on a sort of final stopover where it doesn't leave anymore because conditions don't deteriorate enough anymore, and then we call that the wintering area. And the idea is that the decision to stay or leave every day on a stopover is driven by a number of factors like external conditions such as temperature, wind, port availability. Also internal conditions like accumulated energy stores and biological clock, and individual characteristics like age, experience, and breeding status. And we wanted to split our research into two questions or two parts. So firstly, what's the effect of temperature on these daily stopover leaving decisions during autumn? And to find that out, we model the chance probability to stay or leave on a stopover with temperature and some other covariables. And secondly, is this effect reflected on a seasonal scale? So if we zoom out, do we indeed see that individuals winter closer to home in milder winters? And to find that out, we would model the wintering distance with the temperature. So we use GPS tracks for this. A lot of GPS tracks, some a bit older made by Theo company, GPS tracking neck collars, of course, like you see in the left picture, and some newer from Ornithela company, like you see in the right picture. So we collected a huge multi-year migration data set from these swans. And for the first question, to look at how temperature drives daily leaving decisions in autumn, we took these GPS data and firstly we removed the flying positions because we only wanted the stopovers where the swan was actually on the ground and deciding whether it would continue migrating or not. So we selected positions with a ground speed of less than 3 meters per second. You can see this graph. This is a log 10 scale. So the vast majority of the points was actually slower than 3 meters per second. So we took this peak here to exclude all the flying behavior. Then we downsampled our positions to 1 position per day at noon, and we clustered them to determine the stopovers, following a method outlined by Van Wijk et al. In Oikos. So we clustered all the subsequent positions within 50 kilometers and within 30 days from each other. So we assumed that those would be part of the same stopover. And then we only kept the clusters which were longer than 48 hours, assuming that that would be the minimum amount of time needed for a swan to actually regain energy stores and to see it as a proper stopover. Here's some examples what that ended up with. So every autumn migration track was cut into different stopovers. And what we then did was we subset the positions. So we took only the autumn migration points, September to December, And we only took the migration area. So we excluded basically the breeding area to exclude the initial decision to leave the breeding area. So we're actually only looking at the migration decisions when autumn migration is already ongoing. And then we annotated those positions. So to come back to this scheme, the decisions to leave or stay, we would be given in by a number of variables, and we annotated these variables. So firstly, the daily mean temperature, of course. Then the daily mean temperature relative to the previous days to look for a change in temperature effect. The daily mean wind assistance relative to the previous days. The stay time at the current stopover as a proxy for how long the swan has already been there and how long it's been able to rest or eat. Of course, a very rough proxy that is. Then the migration distance from the previous stopover and also the day in the season. And then we assigned a stay or a left to each position. So whether it was the last day of the swan on that stopover or not. And finally, of course, we modeled the probability of leaving a stopover with the covariates that I just showed you. So here they are again. So we modeled this probability with these 6 covariates and some selected interactions between them. And we also included bird and winter season as random effects. And from our models, the daily mean temperature and the wind assistance, the latter one in interaction with stay time and season day, came out as significant. So I'll save you the numbers in this table, so I'll just show you the effects in pictures. So firstly, the effect of daily mean temperature, we see that the lower the temperature is, the higher the chance of the swan to leave its stopover site. And this effect was not interacting with day in the season, for example, so it stayed constant throughout the autumn season. So with a lower daily mean temperature, the chance to leave actually doubled or tripled. And the wind effect is a bit more complicated because, as I already mentioned, it was interacting with the stay time and also with the day in the season. So we see that in general, if the relative wind assistance is higher, then the chance of a bird leaving is also higher. That makes sense. But then we see that the effect is even is not as pronounced purely during stopover. So only later in the stopover, when the stay time is higher, does wind get really important in determining whether a swan leaves or not. And this entire effect is bigger in the beginning of autumn migration season. And then towards the end of the season, wind is not that important anymore. Okay, that's all interesting. But then, of course, a follow-up question, we see an effect of temperature, but is this effect also reflected on a seasonal scale? So do individuals winter closer to home in milder winters as a result of these daily decisions that they make? And to do that, we modeled the wintering distance with the winter temperature. So again, we went to the GPS data and we took only the midwinter, so the months of December and January, because those are the 2 months in general where the swans are furthest from their breeding grounds. We downsampled those positions to 1 position per day at noon. And then we subset the midwinters with at least 7 days of data in both December and January. So we could actually say that we actually had a good idea of where the swan was that winter. And then we subset only the birds of which we had 2 or more midwinters of data, quite important to actually be able to show a trend within individuals. And this left us with 54 bird midwinters consisting of almost 3,000 bird midwinter days. And then we annotated all those days with the midwinter temperature, we annotated all the midwinters with the midwinter temperature. And for that, we took the temperature across the midwinter distribution area, which you see in red indicated here on the right, to give a very rough proxy of how harsh or how mild that winter was. And we took those data from the ERA 5 temperature data set. And then we calculated the mean midwinter distance from the breeding area. And we took Narian Mar as an anchor point for the breeding area. Then, of course, we wanted to check whether the midwinter distance is influenced by the midwinter temperature within individual tracts throughout the years. But temperature showed a trend over the years. So if we would find an effect of midwinter temperature on the midwinter distance, you could also say, well, maybe there's something else going on, something chronological trend that doesn't necessarily have to do with midwinter. That's why we decided to run 3 models and compare them. So firstly, model the midwinter distance with the year to just check for a chronological trend. Secondly, model the midwinter distance with the end tracked winter of the individual to actually check if there's a trend within the lives of individuals. So that's slightly different from the first model. And thirdly, we modeled the midwinter distance with the midwinter temperature to actually check for flexibility towards temperature in the wintering area choice of individuals. Firstly, this is the model where we modeled the midwintering distance from the breeding area on the y-axis with the winter season. And we see that during the years, swans wintered progressively closer to the breeding ground. The distance became smaller. There's a trend, but the trend can be better, as we found out, because if we looked at the end track winter, so trends within individual lives, this variable explained more variation in the midwintering distance, as we see from the AIC value that's quite a bit lower than the previous one. So this model was actually a better fit. But then if we looked at how mean midwinter temperature explained the midwinter distance, that was by far the best model. So a large part of the variation in midwintering distance was actually explained by midwinter temperature on top of just the trend over the years. Showing that this midwinter temperature is actually the most important factor in explaining this. And the shift was actually quite large. So for every degree Celsius that the midwinter was warmer on average, an individual swan wintered 100 kilometers closer to its breeding ground. It's quite a substantial shift. So to conclude, we saw that the Buick swans are flexible towards temperature throughout autumn migration. They're also flexible towards wind, so the wind effect was slightly larger than temperature, but only later during the stopover and early in the season. So later in the season, wind wasn't that important anymore, but temperature stayed important. And this flexibility was definitely reflected on the seasonal scale. So milder winters see individuals collectively wintering further northeast. Leading to the conclusion that Buick swans actually do adjust their wintering area to a warming climate. Some discussion on future outlook. So we saw that there was already a trend throughout the years in how far these swans winter from the breeding area underneath the temperature effect. So there could be other things going on, other trends that also changed over years. For example, food availability, like an increase in maize cultivation, especially in the eastern part of the wintering area. And that's something that would be interesting to look into. If we link that back to this graph I showed you before, there's actually some quite important things in here that I didn't stress, that I didn't treat in this analysis, like the accumulated energy stores, but also the experience in the breeding status. Those are some quite important factors that could well drive or co-drive these decisions that these swans make in autumn. So yeah, we should also look at foraging and breeding status in following analysis. And foraging we can deduce from behavior classification from accelerometer data, which are also collected by the trackers that we have. And we also have accelerometer data from previous years. And breeding status, we can derive those from GPS, accelerometer, and observations, as showed in the article by Kees Schreven. So by using those techniques, we can actually incorporate those factors in future analysis as well. So yeah, to come back to where we started, the paper by Russia showed that the short stopping, so wintering closer to the breeding area, was due to both individual plasticity and a generational shift. And here we see that there's a large amount of individual plasticity, which is driven primarily by climate. But then the question rises, of course, how does that compare to the generational shift? So to what extent are migration decisions and wintering area transmitted between generations? Because of course, these swans migrate in family groups. So we can wonder to what extent autumn decisions in wintering area are a consequence of social learning or of genetically or epigenetically transferred information. And to address those questions, we would have to actually compare adults with juveniles. So see what juveniles do and to what extent those decisions are biased towards what their adults did, their parents did, and follow juveniles throughout the years to see how their choices they make and how their wintering area actually changes throughout the years, and compare that to what their parents did. These are topics that Bart is going to touch upon a bit more. I think that was it. Thank you for your attention. Thanks to a whole bunch of people who assisted or collaborated throughout the years. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.